What is the scroll and what's in it? Yeah, what's in the scroll and why the scroll?
Okay.
What's Babylon?
Babylon. Okay.
This might have been mentioned a little bit, but what's the reasoning behind why the darkness can overcome like the believers in a certain, I forget the chapter, but it said like the enemy can prevail.
Maybe chapter 13.
I'd love to unpack the testimony of Jesus as the spirit of prophecy. That gets thrown around in charismatic circles a lot. I'd love to just understand that better.
The darkness overtaking believers, just to, so we have the verse reference for that, if the one that you're thinking of is verse 7, 13:7, and also it was allowed to make war on the saints to conquer them. Is that the one? Okay.
Was the King of Kings on the leg a tattoo?
Are the four angels still waiting on the bottom of Euphrates, or is that more like a symbolic?
In which chapter? Chapter 17 or chapter 8 or 9?
17.
This is chapter 16 for my question.
Which one was?
God's wrath.
Who's the Nickelodeons? It's not spelled right, but that's okay.
Could we unpack the red beast that Babylon is sitting on, because it seems to be different from the beast that comes out of the pit and is somehow against that beast? There's like an odd sort of conflict there.
Yo, burgers. I had a question for chapter 19 about the angel that comes with the white horseman.
Uh-huh.
Why is the angel given direction to eat the flesh of the kings?
In which chapter 19?
Yeah, verse 17 through 18.
Eat the flesh.
Yeah, they bring supper.
Okay, to add to the four angel Euphrates, I think chapter 9, I was asking that same question.
Okay, yeah.
And then also, is there a counterfeit trinity with like the enemy, the beast, and the dragon?
Any other ponderances?
What's the significance of the emerald rainbow?
Emerald rainbow, yes.
Who is the prostitute in chapter 17 to 18? Or what?
Who's the prostitute in chapter 17? It's quicker to write than prostitute.
Who are the two prophets?
The two witnesses of chapter 11.
The prophets.
Any other ones? Okay. Ivan, and then we'll transition. She can always ask questions as we go along, of course.
So it says that there's 7 woes, or the bowls that are poured out. Is there significance or an origin of why the 7?
Why 7 everything? I mean, 7 churches, seals, bowls, trumpets. There's woes, all the things. That'll be a important one. Okay, so great. This gives us a good start, and a lot of these things are things I will talk about, and so I'll just erase them off the board as we go along. If I miss something, then each day I will start. I'll take a look and see if there's anything I had missed, something that we passed by or something like that, and then as we go along, if I feel like I have answered something, I'll wipe it off, and I'll say that I feel like we've covered it. But if you have more questions on it, please do ask as we go along. Okay, so Book of Revelation, we have a lot of ground to cover over 4 days. In this book, there's a lot of things to talk about and a lot of thoughts about this book. And when we think about the Book of Revelation, it is interesting to me that oftentimes in the Western context, the book tends to be one that invokes confusion and fear. For most people in the United States, talking about the Book of Revelation, unless they have been excessively convinced of one perspective on the book, tend to find it confusing. Most Christians find it hard to understand. And even us in this room, we may have read it and felt like, man, there's a lot in here I just do not get whatsoever. And I'm not even sure where to start to begin to understand some of the things that are going on in the book. And that is fascinating to me because that is not the experience of every Christian across the globe. I have a friend who I talked to when I was first preparing the Book of Revelation years ago, and he had pioneered SBS all over the Eastern Bloc. There was 3 SBSs he pioneered in Russia, one that was in the Czech Republic after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and a couple others in the 90s around that area. And the thing that fascinated me about the conversations I had with him about this book is that he said that when he would stand up in front of Christians who had lived under persecution and ask them if, like, did you guys have a hard time understanding this book, or were there things that were confusing? Pretty much nobody in the room felt that it was. That believers facing persecution tended to have a much easier time understanding the book and being encouraged by it, whereas Christians in the West who were living in peace tended to be fearful and confused by it. And I think that this gets at an underlying intention of the book of Revelation, which is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comforted. Okay? And so as Christians face persecution, they read this book and they're like, yes, Jesus is victorious. He wins, he overcomes, he conquers, and I share in that victory. And even though my life I might face death and head towards the end, that is where I share with Christ. Whereas in the West, we are fearful of what might come because of the need for endurance or persecution or tribulation or difficulties. And so the encouragement really for this church, or for the churches here, is to endure with Christ and to share in his victory. And I think for us as well, we've got to understand the implications of the book in that direction, right? That for us, when we are facing persecution, facing challenges, difficulties, the need for endurance and perseverance, that this book will tend to be one of encouragement for us. And when we might be in times of incredible peace and comfort, laid back, easy life, that this book will tend to leave affliction in our hearts. A sense that, man, there are some things I need to be concerned about and to think about. Now, if this is the case, written to churches that are facing some kind of persecution for their faith, which I think we'll highlight a number of key points that I would suggest that is probably a key aspect to this book, is that Christians only faced systematic persecution in the first century under Nero. And that was the only time in the first century where there was any kind of governmental persecution of Christians. And there were only sporadic moments of governmental persecution throughout the early church's history. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't other forms of persecution. Now, if the book is written into this situation where Christians are facing some kind of persecution or some kind of rejection by society simply because they are followers of Jesus, then I think that this book has more relevance today than at any other time in its history. because there were more Christian martyrs in the 20th century than there were in the previous 1900 centuries combined. Okay, according to Voice of the Martyrs, more Christians were martyred between 1900 and 2000 than there were between the inauguration of the church at Pentecost and 1899. And so this book is just as relevant today as it ever has been, right? To the church who needs to hear the encouragement that Christ is with them. He is calling them to endurance, and so that they might share in his victory and be clothed in robes of victory. And so we must hear the message of the book to stand with Christ and to share in the victory of Christ, because that is what it is all about, right? It is the endurance, the example that we might give. And if we think about the initial persecution of Christians here, society looks on in mockery, right? This is a depiction of the Neronian persecution, where Christians are being tied up on stakes here and wrapped up in hay, and then they are tarred and lit on fire for lamps at Nero's dinner parties. And there are very clear records of that in Roman historians. There is no disputing the ways that Nero just abominably persecuted Christians. And on looking, you have the relaxed crowds sitting, watching these things, some of them drunk, some of them just watching, others of serving, all these different postures of just the way that society looks upon the Christians in total rejection of them, without a care in the world of the ways that they are being treated. And it is in this place that Christians are called to endure and to face what might come. Now, as we get into looking at the book of Revelation, there's all sorts of different feelings we might have about the book. And, you know, there's those people that we might have encountered who it's the only book in the Bible they like to talk about. And then other people who it's the book in the Bible they never want to talk about. You know, and we want to be those who have a faithful approach to this book so that we can engage with it, not be afraid of it, not disengage with it, but be able to at least explain a little bit about what might be going on here and how we might relate to it. Now, one of the things that's unique about the book of Revelation in light of this and our present time is that every single generation of Christians throughout church history has thought the book is being fulfilled in their lifetime. Okay? So the attitude that we have, we're living in the end times, and I can see the book of Revelation being fulfilled, has been said by every Christian every year for the past 2,000 years. Okay, you can survey church history and their views on eschatology, their views on Revelation, and what you will find is continual predictions since the beginning of the church and continual perspectives that we are living in the end times. Now, that should not deter us from that perspective. I think that that's a key aspect to the Holy Spirit's inspiration of this book, is that every generation of Christians would read this with a sense of urgency, and that they would engage with this with the reality that we don't know when Christ is going to come back. And so we are called to be people who understand the times and are living in light of the situation that we are in, right? In light of godliness, facing the persecution or opposition that we might face, and not wavering in our commitment to Jesus Christ. And so as we get into looking at this book, we have got to think about how it is written, right? The literary genre, so that we can engage with it properly. Because Jesus didn't just show John a bunch of random visions, but he showed John these things in such a way that John composes them as a amalgamation or an eclectic collection of genres. And so this book is not just one genre of literature, which we have become quite familiar with, right? When you open up an epistle, you feel you're going to read primarily epistolary literature, and there might be a little bit of poetic stuff in there, right? Historical narrative, you're going to read things that are primarily narrative-based. But even in the Pentateuch, when you read the book of Genesis, you have historical narrative, poetry, genealogies. The book of Numbers is the most diverse genre book in the entire Bible, collecting more than 14 different genres in its single collection of the book of Numbers, 1 through 36. And so we shouldn't be surprised when we come to Revelation and think about that, But the difference with Revelation is that these genres are blended together. And so instead of being sequential or beginning and ending in the book, they blend and overlap. And so the most popular or kind of the key one for us to understand, and we'll spend the most time in because it's the one that's more new to us, is apocalyptic literature. Now, when you hear the word apocalypse, what do you think? We don't have to have the mic run, but aliens, zombies, Ready Player One, aliens. Say it louder, Bailey. Or Annie? Maze Runner. Okay, what about not movies? What kind of ideas come to your mind, like imagery? Desolate, war, destruction. Okay, so these kinds of things, that's what comes to our mind when we get apocalypse, is like desolate landscapes, destruction, nuclear fallout, the wars, those kinds of things generally come to mind when we think about apocalypse. And this is what is a hang-up for us as we come to the book of Revelation, is because that word is adequate and properly defined in the English dictionary as so, but is not what the word meant to its readers in the first century. And so when we think about apocalypse, we have a certain perspective in mind, but when we talk about apocalyptic literature, it has nothing to do with the end of the world, destruction, desolation, war, anything like that. We have imposed that perspective back on the book of Revelation. The word revelation simply just means revealing something that was hidden. Okay, the word apocalypsis is the word we translate as revelation, and it's the revealing of things that were formerly hidden. And then we transliterate it as apocalypse or apocalyptic from the word apocalypsis in the Greek. And the first word of this book, the revelation of Jesus Christ, is the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, if you want to go most like transliterated. Okay? So when we think about apocalyptic literature, we need to keep in mind kind of what it would have meant to the people at that time, because it doesn't have the same implications that it does when we hear the word apocalypse. So this writing style was most popular between the second century BC and 2nd century AD amongst Jews, and that's where it was primarily developed, was amongst Jewish communities, and then amongst Christians. And so Christians took on the genre of literature and began writing in that as well. And so the book of Revelation appears near the end of this period, in the end of the 1st century, but then you get other books like The Shepherd of Hermas, which is the most popular extra-biblical book in the early church, and it is an apocalypse that reads very much like Revelation in many ways. And it's a fascinating book. It's in a collection called The Apostolic Fathers. Worth a read sometime. Now, in the Old Testament, Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Zechariah are the books that predominantly contain some kind of apocalyptic genre. Now, none of these books are completely apocalyptic, but each one of them does contain elements of apocalyptic literature. And so in light of that, the book of Revelation will draw a lot on these books as it is putting together visions and meaning. Yeah, Joanna. Yeah, what about Matthew, the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple, or the end times, depending on how you take the passage? There could be some elements that are drawn into the book of Revelation, but it doesn't seem to be a primary influence as the Old Testament is. And we'll look at how that is as we get along in symbolism and things like that. Yeah. Now, when we think of apocalyptic literature, we tend to think of something like this, a sunset. We're heading into darkness. We look ahead and we're like, there's dark days ahead. You know, I mean, you think about all the World War III memes that have come up in the past few days, right? And you're like, okay, we are heading towards darkness. Everything looks bad and that kind of stuff, right? But this was not the perspective of the original readers of the book. They didn't think about apocalyptic literature like this. They thought about apocalyptic literature like this, as a sunrise, not a sunset. Okay? And this is the perspective you want to have as you read through this book, because the reality is that the scripture tells us that we are already in darkness and we are waiting for the glorious light of the Lord to dawn. Okay? We are not in the light. As much as we might think that way, and as much as the world might communicate that idea that we are presently living in the light of enlightenment, in the light of modernity, in the light of technology, all the things that have blessed our society, the reality is that the Scripture tells us we are living in darkness. And we are waiting for the day to dawn. And the book of Revelation is communicating a message that essentially says the sun is rising and you can see the dawn coming. And that's kind of how Christians live, right? Christians live in the spiritual state of like 1 a.m. to 5 a.m., right? That's where Christians are living in the world. That's why people think we're weird, right? It's like having spiritual jet lag, okay? When, your roommate comes in, we all know well, right? Your roommate comes in with jet lag, and they're up at 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., and you're like, just go to sleep, right? They stumble out of bed, kick your laptop across the floor, like making all the noise in the kitchen. You're just like, just leave the room, That's how Christians are treated by the world because they live in a different time zone spiritually, right? Christians are awake in the night, and they are treated by the world who is asleep in the darkness. That's how Paul puts it in Thessalonians. The world is asleep in the night. Christians must be awake. But it is unusual for them because they don't act like anybody else. The world says you should be asleep, you should be acting just like us. Right? And so the Christian lives in this place, looking for the dawn, seeing the light on the horizon, and saying, I know the sun is going to crest soon. And I can see it coming. Right? And that's kind of this place that we live in and how apocalyptic literature should be thought about. And so, what are some of the key things that make up apocalyptic literature that help us to read the book, or things that we need to be aware of for the literary genre? Apocalyptic literature is commonly made up of visions. Now, the visions are meant to be taken in the big picture before the details are examined. And oftentimes, the big picture the meaning of the big picture is greater than the sum of its parts. Okay, so if you take all the details and you add up all the meaning of the details, you will have more implication from the big picture than the sum of all of those details. And while it is tempting to just look at the details and try to figure out what is meant by the picture, that if you did not grasp the big picture, then the details will not carry as much meaning. And so we've got to look at the whole picture before we start picking apart the elements of it. Because it is the details that contribute to the big picture in its meaning rather than make the big picture what it is. Now, as we look at the book and understand that it is written with a compilation of visions, what we need to realize and think about is that the intention of this is so that your ears would become eyes. Okay? The writers are meaning for you to have an active imagination while you read these visions. So you are picturing them, you are thinking about them. You're not just looking at the words on the page, but you're allowing it to create a story in your heart and your mind as you read this book. And as we look at that then and consider this visionary aspect, these things are fantasy. That's the intention of it. They're not meant to be reality or thought about in a real sense, but in a fantasy sense, a larger than life, much bigger picture, right? The idea of beasts coming out of the ocean or dragons falling from the sky, people being clothed in the sun, these kinds of imagery are meant to portray fantasy rather than reality. And that is the case for all apocalyptic literature, not just the book of Revelation. And so when we look at it in its whole genre, these things are very clear. Now, the difference here is that Revelation operates, so the difference I would say in visions here versus visions in the Old Testament. Okay? In the Old Testament, prophecies and visions stand alone. You can take one prophetic oracle and you can extract it from the text and you can interpret and observe and look at that oracle. And oftentimes that oracle will not have building blocks for the following oracles. Right? You can take out a chapter from Isaiah, you can explore that chapter, and there may not be something widely implicational for the very next chapter. But if you tried to do that to the book of Romans and you took out Romans chapter 3 and just looked at chapter 3, and you didn't think about chapter 2 and chapter 4, then you would be in big trouble. Right? You can't take those things out of their literary context, like you could do with a psalm or with an oracle in the prophets. Okay? Visions in Revelation are the exact same way. We cannot extract the vision from its literary context and think that we'll understand it completely. The visions build on each other like paragraphs in an epistle, and so we must keep that in mind. Cannot extract them directly. The next is that there is an angelic guide. Oftentimes in apocalyptic literature, some kind of heavenly being that is answering questions, sometimes not answering questions, and kind of taking the visionary through the experience. Apocalyptic literature is highly symbolic, and the implications of that are that things that are seen in the vision often will represent other things. And sometimes that's communicated for us. For example, the 7 stars and the 7 lampstands. What do those represent? 7 churches and 7 angels. Okay, so we get the 7 churches and the 7 angels at the end of chapter 1, and that's very clear. That's told to us. And so that kind of gives us an interpretive key to think about other things in the book symbolically and how they might be portrayed, or what they might be portraying to us. So we'll talk about symbols a little bit more specifically in just a little bit, but just to be aware of the nature of the literature. It is often written at times of persecution, which is characteristic of most apocalyptic literature. Now, not all of it, but most of it. And it seems to be the case in the book of Revelation as well. Revelation, as similar to actually a lot of John's writings, is very dualistic. Now, we don't want to think of dualism in the sense of flesh is evil and spirit is good, right? That's a Greco-Roman first century dualism, right? That is called cosmological dualism, right? This idea that the spirit world, spiritual experiences are good things to be sought, to be pursued, and the fleshly world is something to be left behind, and it's evil and broken, and you are trying to escape to the spiritual world through some kind of means, right? That's cosmological dualism. When we talk about a dualistic view here, what we're talking about is like black and white. Everything is either God's or the devil's. Okay? It is either like following Jesus or following the beast. Okay? You are either the people of the Lord or the people of the world. There is no in between. There's no gray area. And so in that perspective, it is very dualistic in its view on the universe and what is happening. And in light of that, it is very deterministic. And what that means is that God is sovereign. So what you see is that he is the one moving history towards its final culmination, and nothing can deter his action plan for doing so. Right? He's in control from beginning to end. And as much as the world and the systems of the world might like to think that they are in charge, it is the Lord who is ultimately bringing history to its finality. Okay? And so these are elements that we see across all apocalyptic literature. But what are some of the things that are different in apocalyptic literature from others? Or the book of Revelation from other apocalypses? The first is that other apocalyptic literature is primarily pseudepigraphical. Now what that means is it is falsely authored. So you have somebody who is claiming to be somebody else writing the book. So Enoch, for example, the author of Enoch claims to be Enoch from Genesis chapter 5. Enoch did not write the book of Enoch. Nobody thinks Enoch wrote the book of Enoch, and nobody in the first century thought Enoch wrote the book of Enoch. Okay? Everybody understood that book to be pseudepigraphical. Okay? Other apocalypses, there's an apocalypse of Abraham, there's one of Peter, the shepherd of Hermes. There's various ones that often take on a character or a person who is not the author and try to portray the work in such a way that it should be accepted because of who is writing down the experience. The book of Revelation doesn't give any kind of attitude of pseudepigraphical nature. So John is not trying to convince you of who he is or his reputation or his background or anything like that. Does it have to be John the son of Zebedee? No. Right? There's nothing in here that necessarily conveys that it has to be the John the son of Zebedee, and there was even debates amongst the early church about which John this is. Because he just says, John, your brother. Right? And so the book of Revelation is not trying to convey any kind of convincing towards the readers that this is written by somebody who should be automatically received as authoritative in the subject matter, right? It's just, God showed John a vision. That's what we see. A lot of times apocalyptic literature is very pessimistic throughout until God would bring the finality to the conclusion. So, there's going to be difficulties, hardships, things are going to continue to suffer, going to continue to get bad. But in the end, God will be victorious. And that's the kind of pessimism throughout the book. Whereas Revelation, the optimism throughout the book is that Christ has already won the victory and Christians share in that victory. And that should guide their lifestyle and attitude. The next is that apocalyptic literature is often written after the events in which it talks about. So it is trying to be prophetic, and then it will write about past events as though they are future events. And once they have exhausted the content of their past events and then begin to write about future events, that it becomes very vague and ambiguous. But in the book of Revelation, what you find is that it is consistent from beginning to end. There is no point where the book is more precise or more ambiguous throughout its entirety. It is consistent in the way that it writes. And so we don't see this being the case, right? Revelation is written before these things have taken place. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some things that have taken place in the past. Right, we'll look at that. There are some things in this book that I would conjecture have taken place already, and that they were already in John's past when he was seeing the vision. We'll look at what some of those might have been. But finally, the thing I want to highlight that is common for all apocalyptic literature and coming to a conclusion. So this is not a difference. This is something that is common to all of them, and probably the most important point, which is why we leave it for the end. And that is that all apocalyptic literature is firmly rooted in the Old Testament. And the more that you understand the Old Testament, the easier it will be to understand the book of Revelation. And my opinion is that most Christians have a hard time understanding Revelation or think up all sorts of varying ideas and conclusions about the book because they are unfamiliar with the Old Testament. And that if people would spend more time in the Old Testament, that reading Revelation would become a lot clearer to most Christians. And I hope that as you read the book, you felt like there were familiar things. Right? You read it and you're like, I have a sense or an idea of what is going on here and the implications of it. And we're going to pull out a ton of this as we go through the book over these 4 days of the Old Testament connections, how they might be understood, and the implications for the original readers and how they might have thought about it. Okay? Any questions on these things? Apocalyptic literature in general? Okay. Then let's look at yes, Michaela. While the mic is coming to her, one of the last things I'll say is that Revelation is a short book, right? It took us an hour and 6 minutes to read the book, but there are about 400 and counting Old Testament allusions and references in this book, with very few, like there's not any direct quotations, right? Where it says Isaiah said or Moses wrote. Okay, there's nothing like that in the book. But there are over 400 allusions in this book. And just to put it into comparison, this book is just a little bit bigger than the book of Romans. And Romans is Paul's most thoroughly Old Testament book. And in there are only about 85, which is an enormous amount for that book. And so here you have more than 4 times, nearly 5 times the amount of references in the same amount of content. Yeah, an angelic guide. It'll be an angel that guides the visionary through the vision. Okay. Yep. Mm-hmm. So you see this in chapter 6 where the angel, in chapter 7 where the angel is asking John some questions and John responds, and you'll have this in various other places as well. Yeah, Bailey.
For those references, are they like documented, and are you going to give us a...
Yes, I do have I have a couple handouts that I'll give at the end of the lecture today. I'll post them on the WhatsApp group. And I'll post handouts today and then throughout the week that are helpful for your trip through Revelation. Yes. Okay. Okay, if there's no other questions on apocalyptic literature, then let's talk about the other genres of literature that are in this book. Okay. So what other genres are there? Your thoughts? Okay, we have epistle. Right? I hope that should be obvious because I told you to do an epistle BRI, right? Narrative. Okay? Potentially, if we want to maybe look at chapter 1, but after chapter 1, the narrative is more counted as apocalyptic style than narrative. But if we could look at narrative in chapter 1 with John saying, I was on the island of Patmos and this is what I experienced and that, but it's not a primary genre in the book. There is one other primary genre in the book, which you might feel like overlaps with apocalyptic. Esther? Prophetic. Great. So this is important for the book because in chapter 1, verse 3, what does it say? Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. Okay? So that is very important for us to understand as well. Chapter 22, it talks about John and says that he is amongst the prophets. Okay, chapter 22, verse 9. We also see in chapter 22, verse 6 as well. And the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servant what must soon take place. And so we see these connections with John being amongst the prophets and that this is a prophecy. So the genre is going to be apocalyptic, but this is also a prophecy. Now, what are the two kind of categories of speech that are key for understanding the prophets? There's two categories in which they speak. Foretelling and forthtelling. Okay, great. So we know that they speak in oracles, they see visions, they have all this stuff, right? They have varying things. That's how they speak, but this is kind of the modes or the big picture of what they're saying, and that is foretelling and forthtelling. So, can someone tell me what is foretelling? These are easy to get confused and mixed up. So Moses, what is foretelling? Telling the future? Yes. Foretelling is telling the future. That is where we're talking about what is to come and what is near at hand or far in the distance. Okay, so foretelling kind of takes all of that into consideration. Now, do you guys remember from Prophet Seminar, maybe Kaylee talked about it, what percentage of prophetic speech or the prophetic books is foretelling? How much? 2%? A little bit more than that. It'll be probably quite a bit more than that. 2% will be more about what hasn't been fulfilled yet, which is like the second coming of Christ. That's primarily what those concern is, about that amount. But the foretelling amount, anybody have another thought? 20-something? Yeah, it's about 25% of prophetic speech is foretelling. Okay, so some reviews for you guys from 3 months ago. A foretelling is about 25% of prophetic speech. And then what is forthtelling? Bailey? Talking about current situations. Great. And if the foretelling is about 25% or so, there's varying estimates, but it's in the always in the 20s. So if we make it about 25%, hit the middle of the road, then forthtelling is going to be about 75% of what the prophets have to talk about. Okay. Now, if we hold that over to the similar kind of thing, because John is walking in the same spirit of the prophets, right? He says he is amongst his brothers, the prophets. And this is called a prophecy. And if we kind of take some of the interpretive reflections on prophetic literature from the Old Testament and think about Revelation in that same respect, my conjecture would be that this book is primarily concerned with the present moment of the readers, and then about 25% concerned with the future. Okay, and that's just based off of the common style that they're writing in. Now, we can debate about that. That's fine. But I think given the biblical literature that majority of this book is primarily applicable to people in the generation that John is talking to. And that less of the book is about the future that the people would not have yet experienced. Okay. So we're thinking then, the primary mode we want to be thinking of is how does this relate to the original readers anyways, because, as John mentioned, this is epistolary also. And what are some of the things that clue us in that this is an epistle? It's written to the churches, of course, so we get that in chapter 2 and chapter 3. What else? Grace to you and peace. And so right at the beginning, chapter 1, verse 4, that we're reading a letter, right? We're flashback to quarter 1, Paul, John, Peter. We see this and we're like, oh, grace and peace, like nostalgia soaks over us, right? And so we know that this is a letter because of the style of the book, okay? It begins as a letter and it ends as a letter. Okay, the last verse of the book is a benediction that ends letters in the New Testament, where we see the grace of the Lord Jesus be with you all, amen. Right? That is a common kind of style of the ending of New Testament letters. And so we want to remember that this is written from one person to another person, or in this case, from one or two people, Jesus and John, to the churches. And so there are these congregations that are receiving the letter. And so we do have to do a little bit of recreating of their environment. What were they going through? What were they facing? And what are the implications for interpreting the book? And so we want to remember that all letters are occasioned. Okay? There are no letters in the New Testament that seem to be written just for the sake of writing a letter. Hey, bud, hoping you're doing well. Been thinking about you. Stay faithful to Jesus, right? No letters like that in the New Testament. Okay? They're all like, I can't believe what you're doing right now. Right? Or thank you so much for sending me money, right? There's always some correspondence, there's something going on that occasions the letter. And the same thing would be true in Revelation, that if we're looking at an epistle, we want to think about what is the occasion for these people. What prompted John to have this vision? Because I don't think it's just like Jesus sitting around and be like, you know what, I'm going to show John a vision for the churches, right? There's very clear implications going off of what they're going through right now. So, any questions on anything we've talked about in the first hour this morning? Okay, then let's go to break, take 10 minutes, and have snack. All right, let's come to our seats. Okay. Please sit. All right. So, after talking about the literature, we have a couple other things we're going to talk about. A lot of the lecture today, I mean, we're not even going to get into the book today. We're just going to be talking about like understanding the literary genre, things to keep in mind, talk about the basic information in the author, dating, reader, that kind of stuff. And then hopefully set ourselves up to get into chapter 1 tomorrow. So, now, as we come to the book, there are three things that we want to consider as we approach the passages in this book. Now, before we get into that, I want to just mention really quick the topic that all of this kind of falls under. Everything that we're looking at is considered in the subject of eschatology. Okay. Now, the word eschatology is not a word to be afraid of. The word eschatology is a compound word that means the study of the last things. Okay, the word eschaton is the word last or end, and logos is used for the study of a subject as well. So this is simply the study of the last things, and this is not just things like tribulation or the beast, the dragon, things like that, but also obviously considering the return of Christ, but it might be surprising to you guys as well. Study of the kingdom of God is an eschatological subject, okay? Because the kingdom of God has not yet been fully realized, and so the conversation around how does the kingdom come, what does it look like, what is our involvement in bringing the kingdom to earth, all of those are eschatological conversations. So all of this kind of fits under that umbrella here as far as a systematic understanding. But of these considerations, the things we want to think about, the first is when coming to a passage, we want to kind of ask a question, is this chronological or is this cyclical? Now, you can think of each one of these things like a door to walk through. So if you've got two doors in front of you, then you're kind of needing to make an interpretive decision. Is this to be chronologically understood, or is this to be cyclically understood? Because there are obviously some elements of this book that are chronological. Obviously, when John encounters Jesus at the beginning of the book, Jesus has not returned yet. He's just appearing in a visionary encounter. So the end of the book and the beginning of the book are chronologically oriented, right? There is an obvious flow. But then when you encounter things, for example, like the 7 seals, the 7 bowls, the 7 trumpets, the 7 thunders, are those things cyclical? Or are they meant to be understood chronological? Where the seals precede the trumpets, and then, the bowls follow after. Are all those to be chronological things where you have the 7 seals that open up, and then there'll be the 7 trumpets, and then eventually there will be the 7 bowls? Or should we understand those in some kind of cyclical nature where they overlap with each other? And the first seal, the first trumpet, the first bowl correspond to each other. The second correspond, the third correspond, and there's some kind of reflection to these things. Because as it has been suggested by others, the way to kind of understand some of these passages is almost like a diamond or a stone that has multiple facets. And when you turn the stone and look from a different angle, you would see things differently, and the light might refract differently when it has light shown through those facets. And it doesn't change the nature of the stone for things to appear differently depending on where the light is shown through that facet. But it all remains the same stone. And so in that sense, the cyclical nature of the book may be seen in some of those elements that are repetitious. And we wouldn't just say, well, because there's 7 and because they unfold in this sequence and have these certain elements that they correspond with each other, but there are certain key factors that could highlight a cyclical aspect to certain portions of the book. So that is something to keep in mind and to think about with chronological versus cyclical. The next is something that is literal versus symbolic. Okay, we don't want to just come to the whole book and say, well, it's all literal, or come and say, well, it's all symbolic. Okay? Because there are certain aspects of the book that portray themselves as literal and certain aspects that portray themselves as symbolic. Now, a lot of people will want to come to the book and read it like a newspaper, as though it is everything literal and should be understood as communicating present-day events to us, as everybody has understood it for 2,000 years, right? As though they were reading a newspaper. That's how so many people have thought about it, because it's being fulfilled in their present time. But the nature of the literature is not literal in that sense, but rather carries a symbolic element. So when we think about symbolism, we want to ask what would be like the reference for symbolism and how should we understand that symbolism. And this is important to think about in light of our present day modern symbols and ancient symbols, right? Because there is a lot of symbolism in things today, and we carry certain things to be symbolic in meaning and not just literal all the time, you know, as much as we might like to communicate that way or be very explicit with things. But, you know, if I told you that yesterday as I walked out of church after preaching, I walked under a ladder out the door and a black cat crossed my path and I tripped over it, and while stepping on a crack, I fell through a mirror, right? Now, the reactions in the room tell me enough that the Americans understand that I would have an immense amount of bad luck, probably for the rest of my life, right? Right? All of those things compounding and then multiplying, they all happen at the same time. Right? I am unlucky for the rest of my life, right? Now, who in the room doesn't understand those things? Okay? There are a handful of hands going up. Notice that the hands that go up around the room are the foreigners, right? Not Americans. Okay? Okay, this is important, you guys, because symbols are culturally nuanced. Okay, symbols are culturally nuanced. Now, for those in the room who are not Americans and don't get those references, each one of those things is considered to bring some kind of bad luck to people, and while there might be some kind of superstition around how many years of bad luck you would have, you know, people say you get 7 years of bad luck for breaking a mirror, or a cat crosses your path as a certain number of years of bad luck. If you walk under a ladder, it's the same kind of thing. And stepping on cracks or various things. There's things you can do that will result in your bad luck, right? Now imagine if all of this happened 2 weeks ago on a Friday, right? 2 weeks ago on a Friday was Friday the 13th, right? And if all of that happened on Friday the 13th, I would be in for it, right? Now, when I bring that up, okay, those symbols touch us on a deeper level where I don't have to explain anything. I don't even have to say like 2 Fridays ago was Friday the 13th. There just begins to be an assumption because of the given context of what we're talking about that it must have been Friday the 13th if you didn't remember that it was, okay? And so when we look at the book of Revelation, the symbolic nature of this book is so culturally nuanced to the people that they don't have to think about what the symbols would imply. They would naturally speak to the people. Okay? Now, if I told Joanna that I have an appointment on July 4th at the 4th floor of the building down the street at 4:44 p.m. in the afternoon, what would that mean to you? Right? It invokes a sense of like, there's a dread, right? There's like, why would you do that, right? Do you want to die, you know? But to an American in the room, they're like, okay, you know, whatever. But unless you've lived in Asia, then you have no grid for that, right? And I don't tell my family in Asia that my son was born at 4:44 in the afternoon, okay? Because if I told my Korean relatives that, they would instantly assume superstition over his life, right? And they would use that to explain all the things that have happened to him that are bad because of the time that he was born, right? And they would probably say to Miji, could you not have held him in for another 15 minutes, right? Till he was born after 5 o'clock or something like that, because of the implications of superstitious numbers. Okay? So all of these things that we're talking about, symbols, have very real meaning to us today. Why does a bride wear white on her wedding day? Okay? Because it's a nice color to wear. Now, we can assume symbolism behind it, right? We can assume symbolism behind it, but it's not as though you would go and ask some random person on the street who has no grid for Christianity and ask them, why does a bride wear white on their wedding day? Well, it looks nice and no one else wears white. Only the bride is supposed to wear white, and so she stands out amongst everybody else. You ask Christians why a bride wear white, and they'll almost always say purity, right? But if you go to Asia, or let's say to China per se, for example, what is the color that brides traditionally wear in China? Red. Okay? Brides do not wear white. That is the cultural practice throughout all of their history. Brides do not wear white, they wear red. Why do brides wear red in China? Prosperity, money, it's luck. There's all these associated principles with the color red, and so brides will come out in a bright red dress. Right? And so, again, these are culturally nuanced for us. And we might have all sorts of different nuances for colors, whether that's things like green symbolizing life, or black as like darkness or death, or white with purity, purple with royalty. And we associate certain things with certain colors. We associate things with certain numbers, and with other varying cultural symbols. You know, for example, would there be someone in the room who could explain to me this idea of a lion fighting a bear, and the bear overcoming the lion, but an eagle comes to rescue the lion and defeats the bear? Anybody have a grid? Kaylee? Bailey? Okay, keep going. There's a lion that's being defeated by the bear. Yeah. Right? So you have Russia, who is seemingly defeating England, and then the United States comes to rescue England from their impending defeat by the bear. Okay? It's happened more than once. Happened more than once. So that being said, you guys, right? Not all of these symbols would be meaningful to all of us all the time, but we could rely on the entirety of the community to be able to understand the implications of certain things and explain them. And once they are explained, then it's like, oh yeah, obviously that is the case, right? That's clearly what's going on here, okay? So when we come to the book of Revelation and we think about these things, we've got to understand that their perspective on symbols was just as vivid as ours is. But in the same way that ours are presently culturally nuanced, theirs were culturally nuanced for their period of time. So how do we go about figuring out what what symbols had meant to them in their context? Well, conveniently, this book is not primarily sourced from Greco-Roman symbology, right? This is primarily sourced from Old Testament symbolism, right? And so, let me ask, why does America get associated with an eagle, right? Is it because Americans are eagles? No, right? Why does a eagle connect with the idea of freedom? Right? It's flying in the sky. It's powerful. Most places that eagles occupy, they are the dominant bird in the sky. Right? They are the ones who kind of control that area. They're the most significant bird in that region. And these cultural symbols don't bear symbolic meaning because of inherent symbolism, but because of literal implications. Okay? So when we understand what the eagle is literally, that gives meaning to it symbolically. Okay? So the eagle in and of itself is not liberty, freedom, power, all of those things. But when you look at it and you see how it actually acts and what it does, then when you say America is the eagle, then you pull on all of those actual literal things into the symbolic meaning of describing the United States as an eagle. So, where do you see Babylon come up in the Old Testament? Okay, I thought you were mouthing something. Somebody, what do we see about Babylon? What do they do in the Old Testament? Give me literal things. Okay, they exile Judah. They defeat Assyria. They don't use broomsticks. How about they destroy the temple? Right? They oppress God's people. They build the Tower of Babel. Okay, the word Babel in Hebrew is the same word for Babylon. And so it's literally chapter 11 of Genesis. It is not just the Tower of Babel. That's a transliteration. It is the Tower of Babylon. Okay? And so the first communal instance of rebellion against God is Babylon. And so when you look at then those kind of implications throughout the Old Testament and you see what are the literal things that Babylon has done to God's people, and then, and also how they opposed God, and then you talk about this prostitute riding on a beast with the name Babylon the Great on her forehead, what should you be thinking about? This rebellious city who has stood against God, who has oppressed God's people, and so the literal things that have happened bear into the symbolic meaning of something. And so you want to think about that anytime you come to the symbolism in the book of Revelation that is built off of the Old Testament, which it pretty much all is. And so you want to ask what was going on in its Old Testament context, because that will speak into the meaning that is being used in the book of Revelation. Yeah, John.
So maybe you're going to expand on this, but should we just assume then that things that are related to the Old Testament events are symbolic? How do we determine whether it's symbolic or literal?
Yeah. You want to look at the way it's talked about. For example, if there's some that are really obvious. Okay, the lampstand is told for you that it symbolically stands for churches. Okay, another one that's really easy is like, Jesus. Okay, he is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he's a lamb that was slaughtered. Okay, no, he's not any of those things. He's a man. Okay, Jesus is a human man, right, for all of eternity. He's not a lamb and he's not a lion, but he can be described that way metaphorically, right? And so when we see they follow the lamb wherever he goes, we know that it is symbolic for Jesus, right? That's an easy one for us because we talk about Jesus as the lamb all the time, but none of us probably picture him as a white woolly lamb in heaven worshiping this picture of a lamb. And if you are, let's talk, okay? So those type of things are pretty straightforward for us, and I would say most of the things that are being pulled from the Old Testament should be understood that way, and I think we could go as far as to say that things with Hebrew and Old Testament connections are usually symbolic in the book, but things that have some kind of Greco-Roman referent are tending to be literal. So for example, the churches. Each of the churches, Smyrna, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, all those places, people take those as literal places. The island of Patmos as a literal place. But very few people are taking Babylon as literal Babylon. Or, for example, Armageddon as the literal place of Har Megiddo. There's things like that, which I would say should be kind of the general approach or our hermeneutic in the book, which is that we are going to assume that something is symbolic unless otherwise notified. And that's how we would approach apocalyptic literature in general. Yeah. Good. Any other questions? Okay. So, that being said, on all this on symbolism, there are going to be things that are literal. For example, the 7 churches, we would take them to be literal places, literal churches, literal cities. John being on the island of Patmos, seeing these visions, these type of things. There are things in here that we would want to take as literal. But when we look at things, other things, we'd see some symbolic elements to them. And so that's one of the things we want to think about as we come to the book. Generally, things are going to be symbolic, but there will be literal implications as well. The last one to kind of consider as you're going through the book is whether something is taking place in the past, the present, or the future according to John. Okay? What he is experiencing, right? According to the author of this book, were these things taking place in the past, the present, or the future? Okay. Now, there are obviously some things taking place in the present. Okay, John is experiencing this vision. He was on the island of Patmos. That would be his present moment. Okay? But, in the writing to the 7 churches, the things that they are going on are happening in their present moment. But, for example, chapter 12, where this woman gives birth to a child who rules the nations with a rod of iron, is a prophecy from chapter 2 of the book of Psalms, which is a clear messianic prophecy and was used by Christians throughout the 1st century into the 2nd century to describe who Jesus was. And so that statement that the woman gives birth to a child who rules the nations with a rod of iron, and then he is caught up to heaven, is a one-sentence summary of the birth, life, death, resurrection, ascension of Jesus. Okay, it is all there, compacted into about 5 words. Okay. And so, when we think about that, we would say, well, that was definitely in John's past. Okay, John, at the end of the 1st century, seeing this vision, or whenever he saw it, maybe in the 60s, when he saw this, that event was in the past. Okay, so we will want to think about what events in here are in the past, present, or future, and kind of let that guide a little bit of our reading. Okay, symbolism. Okay, I think we can maybe cross the first one off the board here with the baby. Chapter 12, the baby, just explained it. It's Jesus. Okay, symbolism in the book of Revelation. We've already done a little bit on this, so some of these things I won't have to hit on. But just to simply say, I usually will walk through each one of these, but I think we did enough with Babylon and with another, that the reference in the Old Testament, the literal understanding of those things are what bear implications for the symbolic understanding in the book of Revelation. And that's what you want to go to. So if you're like, what does this mean? The first place you should be looking is the Old Testament. Okay. Yes. Okay. The next aspect of symbolism that carries a lot of weight, obviously colors, names, things from the Old Testament, those are going to be very symbolic in nature. But numbers as well are going to carry a lot of symbolism in apocalyptic style. And this is common in Daniel and in Zechariah, in other Jewish apocalypses and Christian apocalypses, that numbers carry symbolic meaning. Now, what we want to be careful of is not to, I would say, pervert the genres by reading what we think about Revelation back into previous books that are not of that genre. Okay, so we want to be careful not to take the symbolic value of things back into the Old Testament and say, like, oh, Babylon was just symbolic in the book of Jeremiah, right? Something like that. Or Numbers, where you go back to the book of Numbers, or you go back to the Gospels, and you say, oh, these were just symbolic numbers, because by the end of the 1st century, the church was understanding them as symbolic, and so those interpretations should be useful for the rest of our New Testament interpretation. That's not what we're doing here, okay? We are coming to kind of a culmination in the literary genre that's applicable here, and not one that just spans all genres. So let's talk about numbers. How about the number 2 in the Bible? What are we seeing in the number 2 in the Old Testament? Let me think. Very, very key one. A couple mixed answers here. John, what did you say? Sent out in pairs in the Gospels. Okay, good. So they're sent out in pairs in the Gospels. Mason? Noah's Ark, 2 by 2. Okay, good. What else? Israel and Judah. There's 2s, yeah. Where do we see like a explicit 2? Like there's Adam and Eve, yeah, but we're talking about like the number 2, like sent out 2 by 2, or coming into the ark by 2s. Okay, that kind of thing. There's a key one. Some sacrifices, sure, brought in 2s. There's 2 tablets. Okay, great. There's 2 tablets there. And so we've got 2 tablets. I would say 2 witnesses. or 2 by 2 with the gospel. We've got the 2 by 2 in the boat, and then I kind of gave myself away here. The 2 witnesses in the 9th commandment, right? That if you're bearing false witness, the way that a witness is proved is that it's based on the testimony of 2 people. And so we see with each kind of one of these things that there is some evidence to witnessing or bearing testimony to something. I mean, the tablets are literally called the tablets of the testimony, okay? And so, yeah, so chapter 11, you get these 2 guys could be carrying something kind of witness, okay? And so I would suggest that based on our Old Testament references that we could pull in some symbolism with witnesses in light of the number 2 in the book of Revelation, which is, and a lot of these things, you guys, I'm not just pulling on like my interpretation. This is wide berth of scholarship as well on the subject matter. Specifically, there's a handful of commentaries if you're interested in reading. G.K. Beale has written kind of this monster 1,300-page Revelation commentary, and he's like one of the leading scholars. I read that earlier this year, and I pulled some things from there, and a handful of other places, but anyways. So let's hit the next number, the number 3. Okay, when we look at the number 3 in the Old Testament, we might think of some things like, Jonah's 3 days in the whale. Okay? We do see Jesus talking about being 3 days in the earth. And so there's a picture of 3. And if we want to pull on maybe some more ideological things and not just explicit statements, there's the 3 members of the Trinity. You could look at that. And so there's this picture of finality or completeness with a period of 3, but also an element of could be judgment depending on how it's used, with the 3 days in the whale, 3 days in the earth, those kinds of things. And then the number 4. How is the number 4 used in the Old Testament? What are some things that are in sets of 4 or talked about in 4s? 4 corners of the earth. Okay, good. The 4 winds. Okay, great. The 4 horns on the altar. Great. And so when we have these pictures of 4, all of those things portray kind of an idea of a square. They can be complete or whole, as they are the corners. That's what encompasses something, and so it communicates the totality of it or the wholeness of it. And so we see this with things as well, with what you guys have mentioned, but also you have the Ezekiel's living creatures that have 4 faces, right? And maybe those 4 faces kind of stand for representatives of each one of the kings of the dominions that they represent, okay? In the book of Daniel, you have these 4 nations that come, and then Christ finishes it out, right? So there are these elements of 4. Now, how about the number 6? Any thoughts on the number 6? Where we see it in the Old Testament, right? We could jump to conclusions on meaning, but where do we see it in the Old Testament? What'd you say, Ivan? Okay, the 6th day of creation, right? 7 days are creation. Okay, there's the 7th day of creation, which is the Sabbath. But the 6th day is when what happens? Man is created on the 6th day, okay? So there's this already beginning that 6 is comparable or used in reflection of mankind or humanity. Now, is that a good thing? Maybe not necessarily, okay? Humanity may represent, or maybe, reflection being created on the 6th day is 1 short of 7, which is the most often number associated with God in the Bible, and so there is this like 1 less than 7. But then, because of the fall of man, 6 might begin to bear some implication of fallenness or of man's brokenness or rebellion against God. For example, in chapter 7 of the book of, chapter 3, chapter 3 of the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar's statue is measured in 6s. Okay, so if you look at the way it's measured, it's all by 6s in there. And so there's this picture of idolatry, rebellion that kind of is carried into then the meaning of the number 6, which may be kind of how we could understand in the book of Revelation. 7 is the most used number in the Bible. And that there's various ways of people thinking about it. Of course, 7 is a prime number, right? You have it as well that it's the 3 and 4 coming together, that this completeness or this totality, wholeness of things, and then 7 represents the perfection of those 2 things coming together. And so 7 is seen with the 7 days of creation being the totality of God's work of creation. The 7 times that blood is sprinkled on the altar is for perfect atonement for sin. And so you have these meanings of 7, which brings things to its completion or to its finality. And then in the book of Revelation, you have 7, which kind of looks at the perfect amount of something or the completion of something that you cannot add any more to the work of what is multiples of 7 or something of 7, you know. So for example, the 7 bowls, 7 trumpets, 7 seals is the totality of those things. There is no 8. There's nothing to add there in any way, okay? Some other numbers that we see in the book of Revelation would be, for example, 3.5. And if we consider 3.5 to be, again, half of 7, obviously, then it could be a limited period of time instead of like the perfect amount of time, which we look at that over and over, kind of the perfection of events. And so 3.5 might be the half of those events. Now, you see a few different measurements. Just by way of example here, the limited nature of something or the period, just a partial period of something. In 1 Kings chapter 17 through 19, Elijah's drought lasted for 3.5 years. Okay? In Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 12, it talks about the 3.5 years. And also people have sometimes looked at this as comparable to Jesus' ministry, which was about 3.5 years. Some other measurements of this, if these are reflected of 3.5 years, for example, in Kings and Daniel and in Jesus' ministry, then 3.5 years can also be understood by a few different definitions. 3.5 years is also about 42 months, is also about 1,260 days, and could also be considered the same length as time times and then half a time. Okay, so you got time 1 times 2 makes it 3, and then half a time is 3.5. And so all of those are representative of the exact same length of time. They're just ways of talking about it differently. Okay, so 42 months, 1,260 days, time times half a time, 3.5 years, it's all the same. And probably one of the easier ones, along with the number 7, is the number 12. And where do we see the number 12 come up in the Bible? Okay, disciples, tribes of Israel. That's an easy one. I think all of us would jump on board with that pretty easily. The people of God is how it's seen. So much so does this number represent the people of God that in Acts chapter 1, Peter and the disciples feel the necessity to replace Judas with Matthias to round out the number of the 12, even though you have no other instance of Matthias coming up. Okay, so there is this implication or meaningfulness to that number for them. And we'll see that come up a lot in the book of Revelation. So if outside it has this picture of the total people of God or God's people, then how might that bear implication in the book here? The next is 1,000, which is used as a vast, indefinite number. It's just really large. So rather than, you know, like in English, we'll say, oh man, there was a ton of people. Okay, but was there really like, what, 5,000 pounds of people there, right? No, because if you have 5,000 pounds of people, that's probably only a couple hundred people, you know, like, I mean, really. So if we say there's a ton of people, we might mean like there is an innumerable amount. There was just so many that it filled the whole room, or too many that I wasn't interested in counting them. And so in the Bible, they'll generally use the number like a multitude, or, gosh, what is the term in chapter 7? I mean, it uses great multitude, but there's another word somewhere else. Anyways, there's ways of talking about a large number of people, but numerically it will often use the word 1,000. Now, the largest number in the Roman counting system, a Greek counting system at the time, was 10,000. Okay, so there was no 100,000. If you wanted to say 100,000, you would say 10,000 times 10. Okay. Or 10 10,000s. There was no word for 100,000. And so you have this kind of idea then of describing these numbers in different ways. But 10,000 is the largest number, so you'll have that here in coming up in various places. So, you know, for example, 12,000 is 2 and 10,000. gives you 12,000. Okay. So anyways, those are some of the numbers there. Any questions on symbolism, symbols in Revelation? All right. So then let's talk about some of the interpretive views on the book of Revelation and how can we understand them? Now, the ways of interpreting the book of Revelation are not the ways that we will be walking through this book. Okay, we're going to be walking through this book inductively inside of its historical context. These are various views on the way that the book has been interpreted in the past 2,000 years, just for us to be aware of them, because these are the primary things people are talking about when you talk about the book of Revelation, are these views. Most people are not interested in talking about the book inductively. Okay, most people are going to talk about one of the views that we're going to put up. So let's talk about the four kind of primary ways the book has been interpreted by the church in the past 2,000 years. The first is the historicist perspective. Okay, the historicist perspective has been popular throughout the church's history and was really made most popular during the Protestant Reformation, where scholars began to label and interpret the events of the book of Revelation in accordance with historical events that had already taken place, so that they might determine kind of where are they at in the timeline of history, so they can tell maybe how soon is the coming of Christ and how far along have we gotten in this timeline. And so they will say certain things like chapter 9 would be the Islamic invasions that took place in the 8th and 9th century from the Arabian region across Saudi Arabia, like that whole arena, in and throughout Central Asia, over into Turkey, down into North Africa, that those things were represented by the crossing of the Euphrates by the cavalry in chapter 9. Okay, so that would be an historicist interpretation of that event. The classic historicist interpretation of the beast is the papacy and the Catholic Church, that the Pope is the beast. And that is a classic interpretation, is not the continued interpretation, but just gives you kind of a lens of how they would go about understanding the book of Revelation, is very specific events that coincide with the prophetic picture of this book. Now, the ways that the book has had to be reinterpreted, because if you imagine 500 years ago, they were interpreting the prior signs as though they are presently in a moment where everything is about to conclude. Jesus is about to come back probably sometime soon, and so we're near the end of this book. Well, when that doesn't happen, the interpreters have to reinterpret what they had done before. And so they go back and 50 years later, they reassess everything and they say, well, this might not have been the fulfillment, maybe it was this thing. And they do that over and over. And you can imagine by the time you get to the 19th century, the 1800s, people have become so disillusioned with this view because they've had to reinterpret it so many times that now it seems pointless. So the historicist view, there are a couple of really good historicist scholars that write commentaries on the book of Revelation from this perspective and have some fair points. But again, it has become so disillusioning to Christians that many people just kind of forget about it because it's been reinterpreted so many times. The next view is the preterist view that will primarily take the book of Revelation as having been fulfilled in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. Okay? Now, full preterism would take the entire book from chapter 1 through chapter 22 as being completely fulfilled in 70 AD, including the coming of Christ. Okay? Now, the way that would be interpreted is that just like Yahweh says in the Old Testament that he will come and he will visit the people, it is often in judgment, right? That he's going to come to Jerusalem, that it's in the form of judgment upon the city. So they would say that Jesus coming back, his coming was in judgment against the city. Now, that view that was promoted and suggested by preterists was then attacked by evangelicals in the 20th century as heretical because it denied the physical coming of Christ. And so the preterist community reevaluated their interpretive lens on the book, and now people would prefer to call themselves partial preterists, which would be that they take everything as being fulfilled in 70 AD except the literal bodily return of Christ at the end of the age. So that is their way of getting around that heresy. So that's the preterist view is that, and they'll accord or assign all of this book and everything that's going on to the events of 70 AD. The third view has been called futurism in the past, in looking at most of this book as being fulfilled in the future at some point, that we're just on the cusp of it beginning to be fulfilled. And that view has been around since the early church in the 2nd century. Okay, has been that the view that it will be fulfilled fairly soon. Dispensationalism began to build on that view in the 19th century and began being popularized by a Bible that was published, the Scofield Reference Bible, in the 19th century that popularized dispensationalism from teachers that were already teaching it. And what basically the view of dispensationalism holds was grabbing onto the ideas of kind of a futurist interpretation, is that we've been living through various dispensations of church history or through world history, depending on which dispensationalist interpreter you'll read or talk to. And that most people will land on the point where the church is presently in the dispensation of Laodicea, right on the cusp of things beginning, or that the events of Revelation have already begun and that we are kind of in the midst of things being fulfilled. Generally, these views will interpret the book as being fulfilled over a very short period of time and then having the return of Christ. And chapter 20 will be interpreted in various ways depending on a person's certain stances in dispensationalism, whether they would be premillennial or postmillennial, which would mean that Christ returns before the 1,000 years or after the 1,000 years. And then, of course, the interpretation of various passages of the book of Revelation are often given as warnings of what will almost immediately or very soon come to pass. Okay. So that's generally what is thought of there. Now, dispensation is a period of time. And that's what that word means. And so dispensationalism looks at the book of Revelation as examining either the whole of the church age and most of it fulfilled at the end, or the whole of human history with most of it fulfilled in the distant future. In the near future. The fourth way that has been popular from the beginning of the church as well is spiritualism, or idealism is another way of talking about it. And this view has been around, again, since the 2nd century, similar to the futurist idea. And what idealism holds is that the book of Revelation is communicating the events of the church age in no particular order. Okay? That these things are going to happen and continue to happen and repeatedly happen until Christ eventually will return and set everything right. And so it looks at more the book of Revelation from chapter 4 through chapter 19 and 20 as a commentary on the entire time of the church, which would be from Christ's ascension until his return. Okay. And so this view is going to look at things very cyclically, very symbolically. They often will not even go towards the point of tying the images even to meaning inside of the 1st century, but will just say, these are kind of the general ideas that the visions represent or that are encouraging for the church and how they're to stand against certain things. And they're very hesitant about assigning certain meaning to things. They'll be very much broad and ambiguous in their interpretation on it. And some idealist scholars will go even to the point of saying that Christ is not going to return bodily, and that history will just play out and play out and play out until everything comes to an end in human history, and then it just kind of either fizzles out, humans destroy themselves, everything ends, and then all the Christians with Christ will be planted on a new earth and new heaven. And that's kind of how they'll look at the events. Now, that again is not received as an evangelical or really Christian interpretation, that point of it. And so idealists who hold to the view of idealism, for the most part, will explain that they will take the whole church age as symbolic or spiritual in that sense, and then Christ will come back at the end. Okay, so is just their way of explaining that. Now, the way that we could consider each one of these views is more as an eclectic perspective on them. And this is what we might describe as all of our view on the book of Revelation. Every person you talk to, whether they are historicist, preterist, dispensational, or idealist, will all have different perspectives, even inside of their camp. Okay? And so in that perspective, everybody ends up being an eclectic as far as their understanding of the book of Revelation. There are as many thoughts on the book of Revelation as there are Christians. Okay? And so we might associate with certain interpretive aspects and really find a one hermeneutical approach to this book, which is like an interpretive approach to the book, as really attractive and the one that we primarily agree with. And then that's kind of where we associate, but that doesn't mean that we cannot benefit from and learn from the other interpretive approaches to the book of Revelation. So you don't have to decide this right now. The point of this brief, incredibly brief explanation was not to tell you what to think or to discredit or promote any one of these ideas, but rather to make you aware of how people have thought about this book in the past. Okay. Any questions? Or other thoughts? Yeah, Avery.
Would it be wise to, moving forward in our lives, as SBS has done, to figure out where exactly we stand on all of these views? Or is it even worth the time?
I do think that it can be beneficial, especially if you're going to go into conversations with people where you're needing to be aware of what people think. You know, it is wise, I think, in North America to become familiar with dispensationalism, because that is the predominating view on the book. But globally, that is not. And if you're going to go minister in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, Australia, you would want to become familiar with all of the views, because generally dispensationalism is not the views outside of the United States or Canada. So just being aware of those things. But yeah, I would suggest it is helpful, but it is not absolutely necessary. I think the most important thing in it is that we remember that this book is all about Jesus Christ. And if we are promoting a view that puts our attention on anything more than Jesus Christ as the central point of this book, then I think we miss it. And we have, I will come to all of the hands, don't worry. And so this book at the very beginning tells us it is a revelation of Jesus Christ. And that must be our focus and what we come back to over and over and over. And I think every conversation that we would have with people should come back to that place of centralizing Jesus as the main point of this book. The main point of the book, you guys, is not to instruct Christians on the nuances of how to endure through whatever trials are to come. It's to put their attention on Jesus as the one who's already been victorious. And that's the whole way that you endure. That's the way that you make it through. That's the way that you live your life, is with your eyes set on Christ, looking to him. And, you know, while we don't know right now what is going to happen or how things are going to unfold, hindsight is always 20/20. And when we get to be with Christ at the end of our life, or when he returns, we will see him and look back on everything that happened, and we'll be like, oh, that was how it was going to happen, right? And none of us are going to care who was what, right? Get to heaven and, you know, find out that the historicists are the closest to the interpretation, and they're next to Christ, you know, and you're like, those guys, like, how did they get it, you know? And we have everybody else was like laughing at them, you know? So there's all sorts of different ways of coming to it. We will all have a good or a better understanding of it when we come to the end. But if our perspective right now is not on Christ, I would say that we're missing it. Right? That's what we've got to be at. Because he's the whole point of this book. Everything is coming back to Christ. Everything's pointing to him. He is the beginning of it. He's the ending of it. It all revolves around him. And we see the beautiful picture of him in this book, the totality, really, of who he is. And so that's where our attention needs to be at. So, yeah, there were a handful of hands on this side of the room. I don't know if anywhere else, but yeah.
It's in light of working. I don't. Okay, sorry. In light of the sorry, in light of the interpretation aspect of our study, is it not more helpful to pick one of these to approach it with as we're charting?
No, because we're studying it inductively. None of these are inductive in the respect of like, what did it mean to the original readers primarily first? Usually, none of these approaches are primarily looking at the original readers, except for the preterist view, which is why you'll often find a lot of SBSs will promote the preterist perspective. I'm not going to do that because I don't hold a preterist perspective personally. I don't think the book was written during the time of Nero or takes place at that time. So, just kind of giving away our next hour a little bit. But what I want you guys to do is to interpret this book for the churches. What would they have thought about it? What was John's experience when he was going through it? And all of these views are looking at what does this mean for us right now today, or how should we look at this in light of church history rather than just in light of the first century? Yeah. Yeah, Bailey.
I know you kind of answered this question already, but can I ask this question for Daniel? Because I've never read this book before, because I'm kind of scared of literature.
Sure.
Do you have any advice for someone who's never read this book at all, holds no views towards this book?
Yeah. I would read it in light of considering the original readers and John particularly, when John is writing this down, because while John is being shown the visions, John is writing this book down and composing it in the reflection of his familiarity with not only the visions that he's being shown, but the genre that he's familiar with, and writing a letter to these churches. So this is, just like every book in the New Testament, a partnership between the Holy Spirit and the author who is being inspired by the Holy Spirit. And so you want to interpret it inductively. What would it have meant to the original readers and from the original author in the first century? Yeah. Nathan, you had your hand up before? Or Mason?
Yeah. I have a question about dispensationalism.
Okay.
And just like wanting to clarify, because I think I understood what you were saying. But when you're saying they're like different dispensations of like different churches, are you saying that like the belief is that like each of like the churches represents like a different like time in church history, basically?
That's one of the ways that it will be interpreted. So the two primary ways is that each of the churches represents a dispensation of time, which may not always be equal amounts of time. Okay, so you might have one church that represents a few hundred years, another church that only represents 1 century of the past 2,000 years. And then pretty much all dispensationalist interpreters of that respect will land us right now in the period of Laodicea. In fact, every dispensational interpreter who interprets it that way, for as far as I'm aware, in the past 200 years, has interpreted the present church time as the Church of Laodicea, right? I don't know anybody who has interpreted ever as Philadelphia, right, which is the preceding church and is actually doing really good. In fact, Philadelphia is one of the only churches Jesus has no rebukes for, but it's really hard, in my opinion, it's really hard to justify interpreting the colonial church as the Church of Philadelphia. There's a lot of things that were going on in the colonial church, not to mention, I mean, all you have to do is read about things Anabaptists did in Central Europe during the time of the post-Reformation period to find out that, man, they were some not hot dudes. Like, there's this story of the Anabaptists who go into a city, take over a city, force everybody to be rebaptized, and then they hold off as an army defending the city until the local regime, like the local king and the region, because of this rebellious city, come in and they kill everybody. But the Anabaptists were holding off because they thought that they were the end times church, right? So things like that all throughout the period make it pretty tough to interpret that era as the Church of Philadelphia and us as the Church of Laodicea. But that's generally how a lot of dispensational interpretations will take the the churches. You may have some who will take them literal, but that is one of the interpretations as well. They might do that. And some will take it as the whole scope of human history from the time of Adam down to the time of the church. Yeah. Yes, Nathan.
My original question was mainly already answered.
Okay.
John's question.
Okay.
But because you did say it would be wise to pick a view after SBS, or at least look into it, do you have any books to recommend to read?
Yeah, there is a book. Isaac, could you grab it for me? It's on the Revelation shelf in the back corner above Yo's desk. It's called Revelation, the Four Views. There's a guy who has come and taught here for years. He's actually a really good friend of Danny Lehman. His name is Steve Gregg. And Steve Gregg is, he's an amazing scholar, has ran a question show on radio stations for years and years and years. And now he has a website called The Narrow Path, all this stuff. He wrote this book on Revelation, which is called Revelation, the Four Views, and it earned him an honorary master's degree. Because this college looked at it and they were like, you know, what have you done? Like, what have you created here? And so they wanted to give him a master's degree because of his work in this book primarily. And basically what he does is he gives a brief introduction in the book of like its date, its author, readers, that kind of stuff, and then he'll go through kind of an intro of each of the views. But then what he does is he lays out a 4-column chart for every passage in the whole book, and he will list the primary ways that each verse is interpreted by each of the views for the whole book of Revelation. And so that's a great book for finding out kind of what do you think about it, which kind of ones seem to be, I think, the most consistent and with the least amount of trouble. The challenge is that being someone who doesn't necessarily hold to, I'll grab it up here, Isaac, you can bring it up, hold to one of the views in totality, more eclectic in that respect. This is the book, Revelation, the Four Views. And so what he'll do is like this, where there's 4 columns here, and he'll go through each one of the views in each passage listing the primary interpretations for it. Okay. So you can have a look at this up here at the end. But yeah, this is the one. I think the most beneficial is to consider inside of its original context, and that would then be, the implications for them would then be how I would pull it into the present time and interpret it in our present moment, just like I would do with the rest of the Bible. So I think it's helpful to be familiar with the views. I don't think you have to even choose one necessarily, but just being aware that there are different views on it, because most, now just kind of like a rule of thumb, and then we'll go to a break. Those who tend to be very opinionated on secondary issues tend to be more ignorant in the Bible than literate in the Bible. Those who tend to be very nuanced in their conversation, willing to have open conversations about interpretive differences on the secondary issues or on debated issues, tend to be those who are very widely read. And so what I find is that those who come and they'll say, this is the way to interpret Revelation, it is like this, each verse is this way, and this is what it means, and this is how we should live in light of it, tend to be those who have not given any time of day to any other view except the one that they know. And that's has been my observation with pretty much every issue that doesn't pertain to salvation or the identity of God. Now, on those issues, we want to be firm and clear, right? Those are issues that deserve us to stand on a solid ground and a firm point. But there are many issues that are secondary that don't. So, yeah. Okay, let's take a break. We'll take about